So in this video, I want to react to an article I recently read from the New York Times. The article itself was published several months ago in December, but I just read it this morning. The title of the article, published again by the New York Times, is "Officers Had No Duty to Protect Students in Parkland Massacre, Judge Rules." And I will put a link to it in the description underneath for anyone interested in reading it. And what this article is basically elucidating is something that is not news. It's actually been uh, documented many times, although it is not known among the general public very often, that the government is not actually obligated to protect you. In fact, it's really not obligated to do anything if you want to get right down to it. But to quote part of the article here, so this is the writer. Uh, but police officers, in fact, generally are not under any legal obligation to protect citizens who are not in their custody. So legally, if you are like in the custody of the police, say you're in prison, then there is a duty to protect, but otherwise there is not. And then directly underneath this, it quotes from a law professor: "Neither the Constitution nor state law impose a general duty upon police officers or the government or other governmental officials to protect individual persons from harm, even when they know that harm will occur," said Darren Hutchinson, a professor and associate dean at the University of Florida School of Law. "Police can watch someone attack you, refuse to intervene, and not violate the Constitution." And then it adds, and this is why this isn't really news, but still worth talking about: "The Supreme Court has repeatedly held that the government has only a duty to protect persons who are, quote, in custody. Courts have rejected the argument that students are in custody of school officials while they are on campus." So, there's an interesting side document debate that could be had about whether students are in custody or not. But in terms of the broader debate about gun rights and gun control, proponents of gun rights and proponents of gun use will often say, well, guns are a useful tool in self-defense. Now, they're not a magic bullet. Having a gun doesn't mean that you can't be harmed or that you can't be victimized. You can certainly attempt to use a gun in self-defense and still be harmed. And there are risks associated with having a gun. You could have a gun with self-defense, and it's possible that you could accidentally kill yourself or accidentally harm somebody who's innocent. Odds of that are quite low, but it's certainly possible. There's also costs that are imposed on you when having guns. They cost money, so for everybody who goes to the expense of owning a gun and practicing a gun and all that, there's only some subsection of that, a relatively small proportion, who are actually going to use them in self-defense. But then the counter argument is that, well, you don't need a. It's kind of interesting. There's two kind of counter arguments to this, and this is one area where the gun control proponents, I think, don't have a uniform voice in this. I kind of hear different things. It's a topic they tend to try and avoid, I think, for political reasons. But the idea is that you either either using a gun in self-defense is impractical or won't work or counterproductive. So this is when you get people who will cite things like the Kellerman study that erroneously report that if you that a gun in your home is more likely to kill you than kill an opponent, which is misleading, because using a gun in self-defense does not entail killing the opponent, your attacker, typically. Also, in that particular study, he didn't actually demonstrate that the gun in the home is the gun that killed the person. But I've done videos on the Kellerman study before. I don't want to go into it here. But there's also kind of a view that this is not as articulated as much, but there is a sense, at least philosophically, among many people on the left and many people on the gun control proponents side, that you basically have more or less a duty to be a victim. That if you are attacked, that resistance of any type is wrong in some sense. Now, they could be wrong in a utilitarian sense, where they could say, hey, resisting is going to be a bad idea because maybe you'll make the attacker more angry or you increase the chances that he'll be harmed. I don't think that the data really supports that view, but it is an argument that I think you could make. And there are probably situations where that's true and probably situations where that's not true. And what proportion of those situations are what actually happens? Yeah, that's a really interesting empirical question. But others will kind of say, well, it's just wrong to use a gun in self-defense, kind of along the lines of it's potentially lethal. If you're getting attacked for something, you don't know if the attacker is trying to murder you or not, and so you using something that's lethal, even if you don't actually kill them, and that's a misunderstanding too. I think a lot of people just assume that a self-defensive gun use means killing the attacker, and that is statistically very rare. That's the least likely outcome. The most likely outcome is that a potential victim brandishes a weapon. It shows you show a weapon, and the attack ends. Because for the vast majority of crimes, whatever it was they were trying to get or whatever they are trying to obtain, the risk that they get injured or killed in a gunfight is not worth whatever they're trying to get, and the situation will de-escalate almost immediately. And then next to that, you'll have the class of cases where maybe you do discharge the firearm either as a warning or attempting to shoot the attacker and you miss. So most discharged bullets don't strike human flesh, and that will still result in a defensive gun use. And then you have the cases where the assailant is shot but is not killed, but is wounded. And woundings can be very serious or not that serious, and I don't know what percentage is which. But the idea that and I had one lawyer from Australia, and Australians seem to be the worst when it comes to gun control. Say, look, it's basically never justifiable to use a gun in self-defense. Even if you don't use it lethally, there's the threat that it could be used lethally, and that you should just I mean, they don't want to come out and say it because it's politically difficult, but that you should simply uh, uh, not resist, and that you should simply submit to the will of the attacker. And that if you attempt to resist, especially if you attempt to resist with a gun, that is ethically unacceptable. Now, I think that this type of argument really goes against the moral intuitions of most people, certainly most Americans. You might get different numbers if you look at Australia or the UK, but I think even there, I think most people would intuitively think, hey, if you're getting attacked, you have a right to fight back. And, if a gun is an option that you have, then why wouldn't you use a gun in that case? But that is not very politically palatable to most people. So there is this counter that, well, you don't need a gun to defend yourself because the police will defend you. And there is this assumption that the police either can and will provide protection for people. Now, this is just a very, very common, again, intuition, I want to say, that people have, or impression that people have. And it's kind of interesting to ask, where does that come from? Because the evidence for it is actually extremely scant. In real life, the way police patrol the streets and operate, and with the whole system of, if they get a call, they have to go to the location. The times involved, the statistical likelihood that the police are going to intervene in an ongoing attack are astronomically small. I mean, I'm sure it happens, but I'm not sure it happens anything slightly above infinitesimally. Now, you could say that police provide some kind of deterrent effect, that the fact that they're out there discourages some criminals from certain acts, and I'm sure that's also true, although that would be very hard to measure, but that is a different thing. That is not talking about attacks that are actually going on or have already been initiated. And the odds that they intervene are very, very low. And I think that this might come from two things. In the media, like in movies and in television, police and the government generally are depicted as heroic and as protagonists very often, and this is portrayed quite often. But this is fiction. This doesn't really happen in real life, hardly ever. And even in the best case scenario, so most of the homicides, most of the crime in the United States isn't going to happen in a high profile public way. It's going to happen at night. It's going to happen in an area like the cliche, the back alley, or someone's going to break into your home. It's going to happen in a relatively private setting because criminals are going to take steps to whatever extent possible to avoid detection, to avoid getting caught, to avoid drawing enough attention to them that raises the risk of bringing down the gauntlet, the police presence. But even in cases that are much more public, like these mass shootings, now these mass shootings are statistically, I don't want to say they're insignificant, but they're one of the smallest subsets that we can have of crime. Now, I'm sure that you can get even more specific and say, well, murders committed with screwdrivers or murders committed, on trains or something like that. But in terms of a subset, I think in the United States we're looking at 300 or 400 of these types of homicides a year. That's a lot of people, but if you look at the total number of gun homicides or homicides generally, you're looking at more like 11,000, 9,000, something like that. So, a couple of percentage points, 3, 4, 5%, something like that. But when these do happen, they're very high profile events. They do happen in public places that are crowded, so the fact that there's a lot of people means the chance that it gets reported are much higher. Like if you sneak into a home and you victimize, one or two people, there's a decent chance that they will be unable to alert authorities or alert somebody else or neighbors before you're able to either kill them or stop them in some other way. Maybe those two people just don't have a phone available or they lose it or whatever. If you attack a place that has 50 people or hundreds of people or thousands of people, the odds of that it isn't reported are quite small. And so, those types of events, especially at schools that have security measures and very often have police stationed there, you're not going for discretion. You're not going for avoiding detection. You're trying to you're making a very public display of whatever is going on in your head. And there really is very little pretense of believing that you're going to, quote, get away with it without being noticed. And yet, even in those cases, the police basically never stop them. In the case of Stoneman High, there was one police officer armed on the location. He heard gunfire going on, and he did not intervene. And subsequently, other police officers arrived on the scene, and they also did not intervene. And by the time the police actually entered the building, the shooter was at a Subway getting a drink. He had left. And this is typically what you see. The shooters are able to basically dispense as much bloodshed and violence as they want, and then they kill themselves or they flee. They don't usually end in gunfights with the police. Or if they do, it's only after many, many dozens of people have been killed. So the question is, as much as the gun control proponents like events like Parkland, because this is kind of the only way they can advance their agenda. If you see what happened in New Zealand, you can radically advance your agenda a great deal from one of these events. And I'm not saying that they did the event, or not that they necessarily like that people died, but it is the opportunity that they need to advance their thing. In the United States, it's pretty much the only thing that generates any kind of debate or progress in terms of gun regulations. And yet, in a case like Parkland, which is very clear, well, apparently the police won't defend you, right? So the idea that, well, you don't need your guns because that's what 911 is for, is dramatically illustrated to be false. And then you have not just an illustration, but you have the government itself, the institution that is supposed to be providing the security, coming flat out and saying it has no obligation to protect you. Whether or not it would have the ability to is actually a perfectly valid question as well. Let's say this judge had decided the other way and they said, the police do have a obligation to defend people. Well, that sounds nice. If they can't deliver on that obligation, though, that wouldn't necessarily be good evidence or good reason for abolishing gun rights or saying people don't need guns in self-defense. If the government says they're obligated to provide a good and then they're just not capable of doing it systematically or at all even, then that's hardly grounds to ban guns. But they're not even going that far. They're saying they don't have an obligation. And again, this is a very, very old argument. This has been brought up many, many times. People have sued the police in cases of blatant negligence many times, where police are on location investigating a crime during the commission of a crime and for whatever reason do nothing. The Supreme Court is going to say, in this case, not even the Supreme Court, just a federal judge, a district judge is going to say they have no obligation to protect you. And this is kind of doubly interesting, I think, in this case, because you have a situation with a school where people are mandated to go there, right? People are required. Education is compulsory. Now, in fairness, it's compulsory at the state level typically, not because the federal government is making it compulsory, but because the states are making it compulsory, or the cities or whatnot. Uh, but you have this situation where the state's going, you have to go to school. They don't specify which school necessarily. So hypothetically, you could go to a private school or jump through the hoops to qualify for homeschooling, which thankfully are not always that onerous. It depends on the state and the municipality. It is certainly possible. But they're still saying every child must go to school. It's compulsory education. But then they're also saying, so you're congregating all of these, kids in these centralized locations, and then you're also saying none of you can have a gun. It's illegal for people under 18 to own guns, basically, or to carry guns. And even if they were legally outside the school, they're not allowed in the school. So you're basically saying you must be in a place that is defenseless, or that the government will provide the defense, and that's the only layer. Now, I'm not against having there be situations where guns are prohibited. There are certainly situations and contexts where a private property owner might say, we don't want to allow firearms in this situation and restrict people from having them. And that's not necessarily always wrong. However, in those cases, you are running the risk, and it's not a high risk, but it is a risk that you are making potential victims. You're making a target. You're making an area where somebody who is interested in mass mayhem and mass death, and thankfully, not that many people are both interested in doing that and capable of doing that, but there are some, that if you're going to make the people who go there be defenseless, then you should provide for their defense. So if you have a hard target, if you're going to have a facility where there's lots of people, you're going to require them to be disarmed. That's fine if you have control over the entry points and you have armed guards there, or some other mechanism that can prevent somebody from infiltrating and causing havoc. But if you don't have that system, and we don't have that system with schools, and there's lots of people who argue that we shouldn't, and I mean, this is a side debate, but I just don't think we should have public schools, period. But I totally appreciate that if we're going to have them, we don't want them to be any more like prisons than they already are, and they are actually fairly like prisons in many respects. You just get to go home at the end of the day usually. And so requiring people to go there, requiring that they be disarmed, but then not providing them security, then I'd say that you are culpable in that case. You're making them go, you're telling them they have to be defenseless, that you'll provide the defense, and then you don't provide the defense. I would say that that is culpability on your part. It would be a little bit different if it wasn't required and people were just naturally congregating, if people were just, say, going to a beach and they just happened to not bring their guns, or going to a nightclub and they just decided not to bring their guns. That's nobody's fault in that case other than the perpetrator. So there's that. There's also, touches on a more general product, that a lot of or a more general kind of issue that a lot of libertarians have raised for a long time. There are all these ideas about social contract, and that we're obligated to, follow the laws and pay the taxes and do the regulations, and that as citizens that we have all these obligations. But it's a contract with the government, and then as a reward for our obedience to their authority, then they provide us all these goods and services, and yet it's quite clear that they don't actually have any obligations. You can't take them to court and say, you didn't do to me what I think is right. Now, you can. There are certain things where the government has said, yes, we will, if you're in our custody, we're obligated to protect you. But they can change their definition of custody. They can change who's in custody. They can change the law anytime they want. They can say, yes, we're going to pay you Social Security, or we're going to pay you welfare, but they can change the law and say, no, we're not. And so there's no real duty on their part. This is a unilateral contract with no terms. Also, if we're talking about a social contract, there's no terms, so you can't pull it out and be like, well, according to Section A, Article B, whatever, you have violated this. There is a constitution, and written constitutions, I don't want to say they have no effect whatsoever, but they seem quite limited in their ability to restrict government power, and they seem quite capable, since they have a monopoly on arbitration, right? If you have a dispute with the government, that dispute is resolved in a government court with a government appointed or a government paid employee. following rules written by the government, enforced by the government. I made a video many years ago called Walmart Court. You know, as if Walmart ran the courts, there might be certain things about that that are really efficient and great, up and until you get into an argument with Walmart, and then you're going to Walmart court and expecting to get some kind of fair hearing, and that's just not possible. You need to have a third party, and true objectivity may be impossible, but you want somebody who's at least along that spectrum approaching that, and you cannot have that with the same party being a plaintiff and the arbiter. And it's even worse when the contract has no written component. There's no actual contract. It's just, we have authority over you, and maybe we'll let you know what we'll do for you and what our expectations are, but these can change at any time. So I think it's doubly insidious. I mean, in general, they're not going to defend you from criminal violence. And part of that is it's just not practical for them to do that. And I don't want to harp on them too much for something that would be difficult for them to achieve, given how divorced they are from the market and the incentives to be efficient and to be practical and to be consumer friendly. I get it. They're not in a situation to do that. And I also understand the motivations of an individual police officer who's like, I got a wife, I got a family. I don't know if that's the true in this case, but I want to live. I'm not going to go rush into this building to stop a mass shooter or attempt to stop a mass shooter. I can respect that, but then at the same time, then don't go and pretend like we don't need our guns because we're going to defend you, which the sheriff of that fucking piece of shit sheriff in that county was coming out and advocating for gun control. I guess on the premise, I mean, there's other arguments they could make, like that, well, if we implement gun control, you won't need to defend yourself. There won't be crime because guns will be banned or restricted in some sense. And again, there's no evidence to that effect. It's not like gun bans make homicide impossible or even lower homicide rates. The best that you could argue is that there is some substitution that happens where some homicides that were committed with guns are now committed with other means. But if the rate of homicide is the same, I don't see why there's any big ethical difference between somebody getting knifed to death and someone getting shot to death. And you know, this is just one of the many illustrations of the different moral universes that gun control proponents and gun rights advocates kind of live in, because they look at somebody using a gun in self-defense, or I look at somebody saying using a gun in self-defense, and I say, well, you know, this wasn't a great situation, but it's a good thing that person was able to defend themselves and protect their life. Other people will look at that and be like, honestly, this is seriously ethically questionable, if not completely wrong, that a person used a gun in self-defense. Or they'll just be in denial and say that never happens. This is something you get a lot. Like people say, you never hear about people using guns in self-defense, therefore it doesn't happen. Well, it does happen. You can actually watch videos of it happening. You can read news reports of it happening. And if you're really interested in the topic, and if you want to make utilitarian arguments for and against gun control, you should be interested in how often are self-defensive gun uses taking place. And it's not the easiest subject to research, because sometimes you're talking about crimes that aren't committed or events that are not likely to get reported to police agencies or to any agency, but empirical criminologists have done their level best to do surveys and to do studies, and fortunately, this has been done many times, and they kind of narrow in on similar numbers. There's a spread for sure, but this narrowing, it makes intuitive sense if you look at the number of crimes that are committed and the number of people and the number of guns in the country, and the numbers are not insignificant. They're not enough to just be dismissed as meaningless or trivial. We even have cases of people doing it in the course of mass shootings. It's just very interesting. This is something John Lott has talked about in his book, The Media Bias Against Guns. When you have people who successfully use a gun to stop a mass shooting, you would think that they would become heroic media darlings, and they aren't. You don't even know who they are. And there was a shooting in Texas the same year as son Douglas, where an NRA instructor killed a mass shooter who killed just as many people as in Parkland. And nobody's ever heard of this guy, and nobody talks about it, even though the police in that case described him as a hero and said there's no doubt that he saved lives. You never hear about him, but you know all about David Hogg and Emma Gonzalez, which is a lot in his book goes into more empirical evidence showing that the media is horribly biased against guns. They don't report in instances where guns are used in self-defense, or they report on the instance, but they don't actually mention that a gun is used in self-defense. And sometimes, they'll just say, "Well, look, we have editorial control, and we can't list every detail." They can list every detail when it comes to something that paints a narrative that they like, but not a narrative that they don't like. But some would even admit, like, well, we don't want to encourage people to use guns, so we're not going to report it when that happens. But regardless of their reporting, we know that it happens, and we have some basic idea of how frequently. And yeah, the best estimates that we have are putting that defensive gun uses are about equal to offensive gun uses. The number of times guns are used in the commission of a crime, not just a homicide, but a crime generally, is about comparable to the number of times guns are used in self-defense. Again, in the vast majority of both cases, there isn't a fatality either way. And indeed, defensive gun homicides are quite rare. I think it numbers only in the few hundred per year, but they make up the smallest subset of defensive gun uses. So, but yes, it's doubly terrible that we have a situation where we are forcing children to go, or young adults in this case, to go to a school, uh, forcing them to be disarmed, uh, creating a target. And that this is, people say, what should we do? Putting a situation. Well, first of all, you should have some perspective on the fact that like these mass shootings are just a very rare type of crime. Most of the violence that happens, most of the homicides that are happen, they're committed by criminals who don't have the same mindset, who don't have the same ideas, who aren't going for the same things as mass shooters are. They are just functionally different, and approaching them the same way doesn't make a lot of sense. So something that might address one is not going to necessarily address the other. I saw one interesting thing I very often hear, when we start talking about, well, look at all these places that have lots of gun control and still have high crime, which is basically, Latin America or Africa or parts of Eurasia or whatever. A lot of times gun control proponents will say, look, but that's because of poverty. Poverty is what causes crime. And like, that's false. Like there isn't a direct correlation between poverty and crime. Poverty is a factor, it's a function. But if you look at these mass shootings, for instance, oftentimes the people involved in them are certainly not impoverished. Poverty is not a component, it seems like, in mass shootings. In fact, some of the people who commit them are wealthy. So it's a totally different demographic, and it shouldn't be treated the same way. But it also should be kept in context, that we understand what are the numbers, why does the least significant statistically subset of homicides have the most impact politically. Doesn't make a lot of sense. However, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything. My argument here isn't to say that because mass shootings are less common or make up a small subset that we should do nothing, but we should look, hey, these are people who are trying to get maximal death and maximal damage. They're also very motivated, and they're not going to be dissuaded by the normal incentive structure. So the potential that they'll get caught, the potential that they'll suffer consequences, a lot of them don't care. A lot of them want to die. I mean, very often it's almost unusual that the shooters in these cases survive, because they're almost always suicidal, or at least accepting of suicide as a consequence of their actions. But having situations that are explicitly full of victims and are disarmed and yet are not defended adequately is inviting attack from these people. And unfortunately, these people are not very common, and so these attacks are thankfully very rare. But that's a problem. And one of the solutions would be to say, hey, gun-free zones are not gun-free zones anymore. People can conceal carry. Another thing would be not requiring people to go. That's a side issue. But if we're going to have compulsory schooling, it's going to cause a lot of angst, because you have a lot of people going to school who don't want to be there and have other things they'd rather or should be doing, right? And granted, most of the disgruntled people who go to high school are never going to become mass shooters, or they're just going to have other anxiety issues or other stress issues or other disutility, right? It's a huge opportunity cost to keep people in school who don't want to go because they have other things they'd rather be doing, whether it's working or partying or whatever. But as the case of Parkland illustrates, some of the people who go to school might have a really bad experience and might become like deranged and vengeful, and you have the situation now where you've created this vengeful person who knows that they can go back and get away with almost anything. And this happened. It's simplistic to say this is the only thing that's going on in these cases, but it's definitely a factor when you're looking at something like the Stoneman, Marjorie Douglas Stoneman High School, or say Columbine, which would be kind of the quintessential school shooting in a lot of people's minds. So allowing people to carry guns there just completely changes the dynamic. It becomes a place where you don't know if you're going to be killed in the next, that you'll encounter resistance. A lot of this is kind of bred out of having the power to have people be helpless. And if you know that that's not necessarily the case, that people could possibly resist you, well, that doesn't mean it's going to stop everybody, but it's going to stop some people. And if they're not dissuaded by the possibility of resistance, they might be dissuaded by the bullet that they get shot by. And yes, it's true that it's possible that defensive gun uses may not work, but they also may work. And statistically, the number of people who are killed is much less if there is a person there with a gun to resist, which just seems intuitively to make sense. Now, the anti-gun control people have very strong biases against self-defense and self-defensive gun uses, and they just kind of will kind of blurt out hypotheticals and say, well, it won't work because the AR-15 versus a pistol is worthless and they won't work and blah blah blah. And like, yeah, it's hypothetically possible, but statistically it's borne out that resisting with a gun in that case is going to, it's not going to make things worse, and it very much can make things better. But if we're not going to do that, if we're going to force people to go and not be armed, then they have to be hard targets. They have to be defended. Otherwise, you just have to accept that a certain number of them are going to be attacked. Now, fortunately, again, the number is very small, but I would, in my opinion, they should be abolished, and the rules, there shouldn't be any kind of legal requirements forcing people to be disarmed. And I'm not saying that everyone be forced to be armed either. I'm just saying that people should have the option if they're qualified, as presumably many teachers are, and presumably some teenagers would be. It's not implausible to have competency tests that teenagers could pass, and indeed some teenagers can, once they turn 18. And I think that if we're going to say 16-year-olds can vote, I'd say that they're probably, if there's 16-year-olds qualified to vote, there's probably 16-year-olds who are qualified to carry a handgun. I know that probably sounds crazy, but I'm not saying all 16-year-olds. I'm saying probably some. Of course, the ones who are qualified to carry handguns would probably be the ones who would opt not to go to school if that was an option. But I'm not going to not suggest something because I think it's unlikely, as I acknowledge that these are unlikely. Although the concealed carry stuff is becoming more well accepted and it's becoming more common. And there are certain states that do allow concealed carry in certain schools, Utah being one. So far the doom and gloom hasn't taken part. But anyway, I'll put a link in the description. I do think this is just yet again illustrating that the idea that we don't need guns to defend ourselves because the government will do it for us is completely asinine. The government either can't and won't. It's a case of both cases. It's not just maybe if we had different policies, maybe they'd be better at it. I suppose that's true. They could get marginally better at it, but they're so abysmal at it now that even if they were twice as good at interceding in crimes, we would still be talking about them having no appreciable effect. But they're not going to change the rule. The government is not going to obligate itself to people. That's the whole point of having, the authority of a state, is to have those people have power over you, not that they become obligated to you. They can call themselves public servants. That's a good rhetorical device to maintain power. It's easier to maintain power if you can couch it as beneficial for the people that you're ruling, but that doesn't mean that's what's actually going on, as it's never been what's actually been going on since as long as we've had states going back 5,000 years. So anyway, I will talk to you all another day. Have a